All right, everyone. First of all, good afternoon, and welcome to this fifth tipping point seminar on projectile technology. For those of you actually who are not in the know of what the GPR tipping point seminar are, it's basically the goal was actually to the goal of the Human Past project was to identify tipping points in biological evolution, technological evolution, and societal evolution, and to start a reflection on how these tipping points were interrelated with one another. And so I don't know if over the last 2 years you've noticed, but if you do a quick search on Google Scholar and look for projectile technology or projectile weapon archaeology, you will have hundreds of new articles only for the last 2 years, which just demonstrate the interest in the subject. And so that incited us, that is Solange Rigaud, who's there, Christopher Nusel, who's as well there, and myself, Luc Doyon, to prepare this little tipping point seminar where we would invite 3 guest speakers. And the speaker today will be in order. First, Stephen Churchill, who is a professor in evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. Second, we will have Marlize Lombard, who's professor of archaeology at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And finally, we will have Michael Lombardo, who is professor emeritus in biology at Grand Valley State University. So the way the seminar will be taking place today, it's fairly simple. First, we will give the microphone to the speaker. After each speaker, we'll have the opportunity to ask 1 or 2 questions. If you have questions, do not hesitate either to raise your hand or write them in the chat, so that way we could ask those questions for you. But keep in mind also that we have planned for a dedicated 30 minutes at least for a discussion between the speakers and the participant, actually, the guests actually, who have logged in quite a fair number right now. So without further ado, I'll give the mic to Stephen Churchill, who will give us a presentation entitled Projectile Weapons and the Evolution of Human Ecology and Social Behavior. And so, Steve, you could probably right now share your screen, and you are welcome to start at any time. There it is. It's
working now.
Okay, wonderful. And you can see my cursor.
Yes.
Wonderful. Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm sorry about the technological difficulties. So I'm going to kick things off with now the question is, how do I advance the slide? There we go. I'm going to start things with a very bold claim. I think that long-range projectile weapons rank among the most important technological developments in human evolutionary history. I would put them right up there with fire as being one of the most impactful inventions, technological inventions in human evolution. And I'm going to back this claim up with 3 points. The first point is that long-range projectile weapons are a component of the human niche, and they've allowed humans to colonize and exploit habitats that they otherwise could not. So we might begin by saying, what is the human niche? And in a review article of forager behavior or forager ecology, Frank Marlowe made the argument that there is no such thing as a human niche, because, if you look at what people are doing on the Serengeti, it's very different than what people are doing in the Arctic, which is very different from what people are doing in the Amazon and tropical forests, which is very different from what people are doing on the Great Plains. And so it's impossible to characterize what the human forager niche actually was. And I disagree wholeheartedly. It doesn't matter where you find foragers, they are behaving as technologically dependent extractors of high quality resources from the environment. Technologically dependent extractors of high quality resources from the environment. Humans use technology to extract nutrients, high quality nutrients, from an embedded matrix that they otherwise could not get those nutrients from. In some cases, that matrix might be the earth, and the technology might be as simple as a digging stick. In other instances, the matrix is the ocean, and it requires boat technology and harpoon technology to extract the resources. Or the matrix might be the canopy of tropical rainforest. Or the matrix may be, in some cases, actually open air, right? Because without technology, this guy has very, very little hope of getting this bison, of getting close enough to capture a bison without some kind of technology. Now, so the human niche involves technology. Projectile weapons are just a part of that package, but they're a very, very important part, because projectile weapons give people access to things like the canopy of the rainforest or resources that are in the water. You may not be able to see, but this guy's got a spear thrower to launch the harpoon technology, or to hunt in open country and to access open country animals that we otherwise could not get close to. So that's my first point, is that projectile weapons are a critical part of the human niche. The second point is that long-range projectile weapons were an important component of the demographic expansion of early modern humans out of Africa. And to make this point, I am going to, I am going to run through a little diet breadth model from optimal foraging theory. Optimal foraging theory sort of had its heyday in the 1980s. It was used to look at how animals, humans, anybody made economic decisions in foraging about what things to take, what things not to take, what patches to exploit, etc. And this might be a little bit of overkill, but I think it really, really illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. So the diet breadth model was used to model what items should be included in a forager's diet. What items will they actually take? What items will they pass by? So in this hypothetical model, we've got 10 dietary items. Okay, we can imagine that these are 10 prey items that a hunter may or may not take. And they're ordered, they are rank ordered by what are called their search costs. Okay, so these are all of the costs that are involved in finding the prey animal. Now, costs are sometimes given in terms of time or in terms of total calories. I've given them here as the cost per unit energy acquired. It takes calories to capture calories. And so we can think of this as the overhead that has to be paid before there's a net calorie gain. And so some items have very high search costs. These tend to be the large packages of calories, like the bison. Okay, they're big packages of calories, but they're pretty rare. Other items have low search costs. You know, I walk out my door and I can see squirrels. They're small packages of calories, but I don't have to search very hard to find a squirrel. So you might think, well, if these have the lowest search costs, then I should focus my hunting on squirrels, right? Because then I'll maximize my energy capture. But we also have to consider the handling costs. The handling costs are everything that it takes to capture the prey item, to kill it, to butcher it, to process it, everything that is required before it is actually edible. All right, and where these two lines cross will generally predict what items will be included in the diet and what items won't. So in this case, the first 5 prey items should be included, and the last 5 prey items should be passed by if they're encountered by a hunter. And the logic of that becomes apparent when you just add together the search and handling costs for each item to get an overall foraging cost for each item. You can see that item 5 here, let's imagine it's a deer. You can see that item 5 has got the lowest overall handling, lowest overall foraging costs. So if I want to maximize my energetic returns, I should focus my hunting on item number 5. I should go out hunting for deer. All right. Now, if I'm out hunting for deer and I happen to encounter a bison, I should absolutely go for the bison, because the bison has very low handling costs and the search costs have already been paid. The instantaneous search costs are zero. I happen to stumble upon a bison, so I'd be a fool not to go for it. Same for item 2, same for item 3, same for item 4. So all of these items should be included. Item 6, let's say it's a goose, I should pass it by because it's going to pay to continue looking for a deer rather than going for the goose, which has high handling costs. Okay, so that's all well and good. Now, what happens if I invent some technology, like let's say a projectile weapon, which lowers the handling costs of items? It doesn't lower them uniformly. The bison already had low handling costs, but it may make hunting the bison more predictable. Overall, it lowers the average handling cost for bison, but it may have a big impact on squirrels. It used to be, if I wanted to catch a squirrel, I had to go out, climb the tree, shake a branch, chase the squirrel, kill it, butcher it, and then I didn't get many calories back. Now I can go out and I can, knock it out of the tree with an arrow or a dart from a blowgun or something like that. So I've reduced the handling costs. So the reduction in handling costs is sort of non-differential across the prey items. But what's the impact? Well, okay, the point at which the two lines has cross changes. So now I would be expected to include another item in my diet. So now I should maybe go for geese when I encounter them. And in fact, I should focus my hunting on geese and then take everything that's more highly ranked if I encounter it. So that's not all that big a deal, all right? But look at what happens to the overall foraging costs. All right, I've reduced the overall foraging costs with the use of technology. And you guys are saying, yeah, okay, big deal. Yes, of course, projectile technology or any kind of subsistence technology changes the cost benefit analysis. It reduces the cost of getting prey. But what I'm trying to point out here is that with no change in the environment whatsoever, the technology has reduced the overall overhead of foraging and has increased the carrying capacity of the environment for humans. With technology, humans can increase the number of humans that an environment can support without any changes to the environment. That is incredibly profound. So the advent of projectile technology, which greatly reduced the handling costs of a lot of different prey items, allows more people to subsist in a given area. Plus, it increases the reliability of hunting returns, which reduces the risk of shortfall. And projectile weapons probably also reduce predation on humans. And all of those things, I think, were integral parts of the demographic expansion of modern humans that begins to occur sometime after 80 or 70,000 years ago in Africa and leads to the expansion of modern humans out of Africa. So that's my second point. And my third point is that long-range projectile weapons function as social tools. They are very powerful social tools, and they were important in the evolution of human social tolerance. So to try to back up this claim, I'll first point out that humans are remarkably socially tolerant. Okay, we do not have the levels of interpersonal aggression that you find in chimpanzees or even bonobos. Humans are capable of sitting in a room full of strangers without violence, and even watching violent scenes on the screen without reacting in violence. Now, of course, all bets are off if it's a football match or if we're talking about like problematic gun-laden North America, but otherwise humans are remarkably socially tolerant. And this is important because social tolerance is fundamental to things like horizontal transmission of information, to cumulative technological evolution, to cooperative foraging and cooperative breeding, even just to pro-social behavior. All of these things require a high level of social tolerance. And along with my colleague, Brian Hare, we've argued that there was active selection against aggression, that is active selection for social tolerance in modern humans during the Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic. So here on the left is a 160,000-year-old early modern human from Ethiopia. On the right is a roughly 30,000-year-old early modern human from Les Aisies in France, Cro-Magnon. And I've scaled them both to the same nasion, that's a little point here above the nasal bones, to bregma, that's a point here at the top of the skull, to the same nasion to bregma height. And what I want to point out is that the 160,000-year-old individual from Ethiopia has got a much longer face than the male individual from Cro-Magnon. These are both males. Here's another look at the same thing, okay? On the left is a 100 to 80,000-year-old modern human male from Skhul Cave in Israel. On the right is a recent human male. And here I have sort of tightly bounded the face from nasion down to the tip of the chin in the Skhul hominin. And now I've transported the same box over to the modern human just to show you that his face is much smaller than the early modern human face from Skhul. And you can see that in lateral view as well. The face of the male from Skhul is larger overall and also longer from top to bottom than we see in the recent human male. Interestingly, these differences, I should also point out that these guys, these guys have got massive brow ridges compared to later modern humans. You can see that in the Skhul individual as well. These differences mirror differences between males and females alive today. And we know that testosterone is osteogenic, and we know that these differences in the skulls of males and females are driven by testosterone. There are two peaks in testosterone that occur during growth and development. The first is prenatal. It occurs when the testes start forming, and there's a little prenatal peak in testosterone, and that produces wider faces in males. And then the second peak is during adolescence, during the adolescent growth spurt. And higher testosterone levels in males result in growth in the length of the face and the development of larger adornments, if you will, above the orbits, larger supraorbital tori or superciliary arches in males. So these things are directly mediated by testosterone. We also know that testosterone mediates behavior, that although it's complex, there's a lot of complexity to it, that people with higher levels of circulating testosterone or greater reactivity to circulating testosterone tend to be less socially tolerant and to behave in more aggressive ways in response to challenges. So looking at just a measure of the projection of the brow ridges and a measure of facial shape. So this is just facial width divided by facial length. So lower numbers indicate a relatively longer face, higher numbers indicate a relatively shorter face. You can see that Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic associated hominins, represented by the orange dot here, have larger brow ridges and longer faces than we see in Late Stone Age and Upper Paleolithic males. So I should point out the orange dots, this is a mixed sex sample because there's so few individuals that I included individuals with both sex. So there are some females in here as well. The blue dots, on the other hand, for the Late Stone Age and Upper Paleolithic are entirely a male sample. So, and this is entirely within modern humans, Homo sapiens. Within our species, there has been a change somewhere after 80,000 years and before 50,000 years. There has been a change in the facial skeleton, which we think reflects a reduction in testosterone in our species. We think that there was active selection for greater social tolerance. Here are recent human agriculturalists and foragers, just by way of comparison. Okay, so what does this have to do with projectile weapons? Well, if you look at small-scale foragers, so here I'm talking about what we often call mobile foragers, not the complex sedentary guys that you find in the Pacific Northwest. But among mobile foragers, they are egalitarian. There is no dominance hierarchy, and they are actively egalitarian. Okay, we might think, well, they're egalitarian because that's human nature and agriculture and accumulated wealth messes that up. No, they are actively egalitarian. There are many, many social mechanisms that operate from rumor and social norms that promote egalitarianism to actual ways of dealing with people who are aggressive. One way that aggressive individuals, people who are trying to assert their authority or their dominance or acting like bullies, are dealt with are by male coalitions. Males will bond together to deal with an aggressive individual. And everybody who works with foraging people will tell you that a really, really important component of that leveling mechanism is weapon technology. That weapons serve as an equalizer that allow people to deal with aggressive individuals. Homicide is as common among small-scale foraging people as it is among sedentized agriculturalists. Here's data on intragroup homicide rates. So this doesn't include warfare, raiding between different groups. This is intragroup homicide rates. Basically on three groups, the San across different intervals, the Agta and the Hadza. You can see there's a lot of variation because the sample sizes tend to be low, but this is compared to major United States cities during a homicide epidemic in the early 1970s compared to the United States overall. And my point is that homicide is not unknown among foraging people. It is about as common in foraging people as you see among modern sedentized people. Fortunately, we have it better than chimpanzees. They're very murderous, but homicide is not unknown among foragers. Some of that homicide is coalitionary. This is the data from Fry and Soderberg. Unfortunately, they did not separate out intergroup from intragroup. But these are cases where there was lethal aggression that involved two or more assailants. So two or more males working cooperatively to kill someone. Of the cases that they looked at, 36% of them were intragroup. And of those cases, about 45% of them involved more than one killer with one victim or more than one victim. So my point here is, again, just to say that homicide is not unknown among foragers, and it is sometimes coalitionary homicide, where males cooperate together to kill other males. Okay, so if we look at lethal aggression in chimpanzees, Richard Wrangham has compiled data which shows that chimpanzees are reluctant to engage in lethal aggression unless they have a numerical advantage. So, for instance, in cases of intergroup conflict, of warfare between chimpanzee groups, it is often the case that a group of males who are out on patrol may come across other chimpanzees, and they typically will not initiate lethal aggression against the other group unless they have a numerical advantage. And the breakpoint seems to be around 4-to-1. So if they outnumber the other group, if let's say it's a solitary male and there's 4 of them or more, they'll attack the other male. Okay, so back to projectile weapons. There was work that was done by a guy named Lanchester back during World War II. He was worked for the Defense Department in England, and he was a mathematician who was modeling what happened when soldiers encountered each other on the battlefield. And he was looking primarily at 2 scenarios. What happens when soldiers are engaged in hand-to-hand combat? Like, let's say one side leaves their trenches and attacks the trenches of another side with bayonets fixed. And he was modeling what happened when soldiers are shooting at one another. What's interesting about that is fixed bayonets are basically thrusting spears, and rifles are long-range projectile weapons. So he was modeling situations in which humans were attacking one another with close-range hunting technology and attacking one another with long-range hunting technology. And what he found, this illustration doesn't illustrate it very well. It was really kind of the only illustration I could find online for Lanchester square law. But what he found was with hand-to-hand combat, with fixed bayonets, there's a linear relationship between the probability that you will be injured and the numerical advantage that you may have, an inverse linear relationship between the probability of injury and the linear and the numerical advantage you have on your side. So if the numbers are equal, if there are two of you attacking one person, each of your chances of getting injured goes down by half. If there are three of you, you each now have a 1/3 chance of getting injured. Four of you, a 1/4 chance. So there's a linear relationship, a direct inverse relationship between the numerical advantage you have and your chance of injury. But when it comes to projectile weapons, people can spread out and fire on their enemy from multiple positions. And so your chance of injury actually goes down as the square of the numerical advantage. So if there are two of you, your chance of injury actually goes down to 1/4. So if you think about it in terms of trying to recruit people to help you deal with a bully, if all you've got are close range weapons, it might be hard to get that first person to help you deal with the bully, because it's like, okay, you know, they're only going to have half the chance of getting injured as they might have if they're attacking the bully on their own, but that's still a pretty high chance of injury, right? Now, once you've got a second person, it's easier to recruit a third because everybody's chance of injury will go down to 1/3, easier to recruit a fourth, but maybe getting that first helper is difficult. But with projectile weapons, it's probably a lot easier to get that first helper because suddenly both of your chance of injury goes down to 1/4. And you suddenly have that 4-to-1 numerical advantage that chimpanzees seem to rely on before they engage in lethal aggression. So I think projectile weapons tip the scales, and they make coalitionary behavior have a much higher payoff in terms of dealing with bullies. Now, I want to point out that this is still the major mechanism by which we deal with aggressive bullying people in our society today. If somebody is acting out in a threatening way, calls will be made, and a coalition of people armed with long-range projectile weapons will show up to get the bully in line. And if the bully has got projectile weapons of their own, they will call more people with more powerful long-range projectile weapons to get the bully in line. So we still use coalitionary behavior with long-range projectile weapons as mechanisms of social control and dealing with authoritative, aggressive, non-egalitarian individuals. So Dr. Lombard will talk about this much more because this is really the field in which she excels. But based on her work, if you look at the preponderance of evidence, real evidence of long-range projectile weaponry, this is based on tip cross-sectional morphology, which I'm sure she will talk more about. The preponderance of evidence seems to suggest that projectile weapons begin to appear during marine isotope stage 4, somewhere on the order of about 70 to 60,000 years ago. And in modern humans before this time, we see big, aggressive, masculinized faces with big brow ridges and long, large faces. After this time, we see males with much smaller, more feminized faces. So I think that this is a signal of active selection for less aggressive individuals, and I think projectile weaponry has a lot to do with that. So those are my 3 points. That's my argument. So let's hear what you guys have to say.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Steve. It's a very nicely presented and concise look at some aggressive tendencies. I'd like to involve as many people as possible right away. So if there are people that have questions, please indicate that that's the case somehow, either by raising your hand or in fact just speaking. It doesn't look like there are any from the group so far. So I'm going to ask a question if I can. What I'm wondering about is, you were very much, Steve, concentrating on early anatomically moderns and their appearance. What does that mean for their predecessors, archaic groups, Homo sapiens, and maybe back in time to Homo erectus, Homo ergaster? Is that a real difference between the anatomically moderns and these earlier hominins? Or is that just a facet of the archaeological record, the vagaries of the archaeological record?
Thank you. That is a great question. So yeah, if you look at our sister species Neanderthals, they have even bigger brow ridges and even longer, more masculinized faces. Homo heidelbergensis, huge brow ridges, very masculinized faces. So we confined our study to Homo sapiens because one of the defining features of Homo sapiens is a more globular brain case. And that changes the way that the face is hafted onto the brain case. And some of that brow ridge, some of the variation between species in brow ridges might be a function of how the face is hafted onto the brain case. So we just limited to Homo sapiens. But I have collected data on some heidelbergensis, and if you put them in, assuming that they're the ancestor of Homo sapiens, if you put them in, yes, they're even more masculinized, but there is a smaller reduction from heidelbergensis, like Broken Hill and Bodo, to those earliest modern humans than there is from the earliest modern humans to the Upper Paleolithic, Late Stone Age modern humans. So it is possible that there was, in fact, an increase in social tolerance with the origin of our species, but there clearly appears to be another jump within Homo sapiens.
Right. Thanks, Steve, for that. We have I see two hands. I'm going to start with Martin Smith, who's from outside our unit. Martin, what's your question?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, hi, Steve. I thought that was great. It was really interesting. A question that arises for me, I suppose, is that you say that after 70-ish, 80,000-ish years, we've got this increase in social tolerance for people in groups being favoured and pro-sociality being favoured. Do you think that then might produce a situation where people are better able to advantage themselves as groups by behaving pro-socially, by going into conflict with other groups rather than within their own group? And do you think long-range projectile weapons will have accelerated that more?
Thank you, Martin. That is also a great question. The way that I think about it is that I think that there's something happening in the Middle Stone Age in Africa, at least at certain times, that increases the payoff for behaving cooperatively. And so the stage is set, and so more socially tolerant individuals have a selective advantage, and there might be some active selection against less tolerant, more aggressive individuals. And I think that is part and parcel of the fluorescence of technology that we see in the later part of the Middle Stone Age, where new tool types come in and personal adornment and symbolic behavior begins to take off, right? Humans were capable of that beforehand, but they suddenly start expressing it. Now, there are some people who think that internecine encounters between groups, warfare between groups, was a major driver. I've never really gone down that rabbit hole enough to have much of an opinion on it. But there are certainly people like Sam Bowles who would argue that that it was a major driver, that conflict between groups increased cooperative behavior within groups. And that certainly may be the case, but I simply don't have either the intellect or the data to say one way or the other.
All right, thanks for the
Thank you very
question,
much.
Mark. Bruno Moret, do you have a question, Bruno?
Oh, not really a question. Thank you, Steve. It was a nice talk and nice to see you online. How would you consider that when you are dealing with paleoanthropological data, we have much more evidences of inter-individual aggressivity for recent times, like the Mesolithic or the end of the Upper Paleolithic, than during the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, considering, for example, the gravation time?
I'm not sure what the question is. So we have
My
a better
question is that, Steve, if we are considering your idea that this kind of aggressivity could be related to the testosterone, and that this could be discussed considering the variability of the morphology of the skull, if we are considering that the Gravettian have a more archaic morphology than the Magdalenian people in Western Europe, for example, where we have a nice collection of skeletal remains. In fact, when we are considering the evidences related to the aggressivity between inter-individual aggressivity between humans, we have much more evidences that this aggressivity was present during the Magdalenian time than during the Gravettian one.
Yes, thank you. I'll also say it's nice to see you too, Bruno.
Yeah.
Yes, that's also a good question. So humans are remarkably socially tolerant, but we're also incredibly violent. But we've changed the nature of violence. We are, Richard Wrangham talks about this a lot. We are much more socially tolerant sort of in day-to-day, and less likely to fly off the handle and kill someone in the heat of the moment. But we are still quite capable of violence, particularly planned violence and warfare. And so I don't mean to imply that modern humans are peaceful and nonviolent. And I suspect that as population density increases and as we push towards agriculture and food production, that a lot of intergroup violence increases, and that's what we're seeing in the fossil record. So yeah, it's paradoxical, but I think we can be more socially tolerant and peaceful and still be a very violent animal at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that it could be more related to the demography of these groups.
That could be as well.
You have more people, so you have more violence between the groups.
Yeah.
For the same territory. It's an idea.
Okay, perhaps we can pick that up after the other presentations. Given we were a little bit late in starting, I think I could anticipate having one more question perhaps before we pass the baton on to the next speaker. Does anybody else have a question? I'm not noticing any indication of questions. I encourage you to think about them, and please don't be hesitant to ask in the session that follows these presentations. So now I'll turn things back to Luc Doyen, who's going to, he's responsible for our second speaker, Marlize Lombard.
Thank you, Chris, actually, for this discussion. Now we will listen to the talk by Marlize Lombard. Her talk has been pre-recorded just to make sure actually there's no issues with internet connection where she's located right now. So we will play the recording, and then right after we will continue with the question times.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for the invite to participate in this seminar. This slide is just to let you know that there will be some graphic content in my presentation today. I show the pictures deliberately because so often in the laboratories of the global north, thinking about the evolution of hunting sometimes become weirdly detached from hunter-gatherer realities. Today I'm focusing on the evolution of hunting technologies in the old world, Africa and parts of Europe and the Levant. In these regions, human biological variability is inextricably interwoven with technology. During my talk, I will also touch upon social dynamics, such as group hunting, male initiation, fostering, and status. I think that we are able to hypothesize about the origins and use of at least 6 weapon delivery systems based on the morphometric statistics. The method cannot determine the use of each and every artifact, but it can assess the best fit ballistic probabilities of large tip assemblages, regardless of where and when they were used. I will talk about bimanual thrusting spears, one-handed stabbing spears or assegais, lightweight javelins, spear throws and darts, bows with unpoisoned arrows, and bows with poisoned arrows. There won't be enough time to discuss everything in detail, but for those interested, I will be drawing mostly from these 2 recent papers. We start about 500,000 years ago, but thus far I only have comparable data for 385 tips from 8 assemblages, which stretches over the whole of 300,000 years. And these tips include the wooden spears from Schoeningen and Clacton. In these slides, the color blocks represent the ballistic standards for each of the different weapon delivery systems. So each color block represents a different weapon system, and each dot that falls within the color block means that that tip was best suited for using in that weapon system. For this early phase, we see an almost equal distribution for hunting with bimanual thrusting spears and assegais. It seems that African and Levantine hunters preferred hunting with assegais, but European hunters mostly use thrusting spears. But I need to measure many more artifacts to assess this impression and test for variation through time and space. Our ancestors probably used sticks and stones for posturing, attack, and defense way long before 500,000 years ago. But bimanual thrusting spears, whether used with or without stone tips, currently seem to represent the oldest recognizable purpose-made hunting weapons, and they were probably used by both Homo heidelbergensis and the Neanderthals. So why would people invent these weapons? First, the sharpened tips would make it easier to wound and weaken prey animals. And with these weapons, hunters can use their full bodily force to do a lot of damage to an animal at close quarters. Any kind of spear hunting is ineffective and very dangerous for the lone hunter, so that spear hunting requires group hunting, which again demands some social cooperation. The MIS-6 glacial phase sees a meaningful increase in hunting with assegais and a decrease in hunting with thrusting spears. And for the first time, we see a possibility of hunting with lightweight javelins. So that after about 190,000 years ago, it seems as though stabbing spears or assegais became the preferred hunting weapons, together with some early javelin experimentation. The smaller assegai shafts now allow hunters to carry more than one spear. I'm currently not aware of any untipped wooden spears at this time, so it seems that most populations now use stone-tipped spears that cause cutting wounds on prey animals. Assegais can also be thrown effectively over short distances of about 5 to 10 meters, and having a single weapon that can both stab and be thrown would stimulate strategic planning within a hunting party. It is possible that the short distance throwing of assegais inspired experimentation with increasingly lighter weapons with longer shafts that can be thrown accurately and forcefully over longer distances. Such javelins would allow for smaller hunting parties to hunt with less risk, providing adaptive advantages during low resource phases. With a warmer MIS5 interglacial, we see a significant rise in assegai hunting. Almost 60% of all stone tips now fall within this category. The frequency for thrusting spears remain relatively stable, but javelin use becomes negligible. This phase may signal an increasing specialization in structured group hunting, during which different hunters may have had different roles. It possibly signals the start of male hunting initiations and symbolic posturing, with both Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals having the capacity for such behaviors. During the MIS4 glacial, it would seem that a wide variety of weapon types were used. Whilst people in the Levant and Europe preferred assegais and javelins, those in southern Africa started to use bows with both poisoned and unpoisoned arrows. If we add the possible use of poisoned arrows to that of unpoisoned ones, almost half of the weapon tips conform to bow hunting, probably used in tandem with javelins and assegais. This is an arsenal that is similar to that of current-day hunters in southern Africa. Some authors have suggested spear throw and dart hunting for Africa at this time, but the morphometric overlap of dart tips with javelin tips makes for unsure interpretations, and thus far I was unable to find any corroborating evidence for dart hunting in sub-Saharan Africa. Apart from the neotropic of Central and Southern America, the sub-Saharan Afrotropic is the most diverse bioregion with the second largest number of mammals and species density. Southern Africa is also the richest in floral biodiversity worldwide, and it may be useful to pay more attention to this map when thinking about developments in Pleistocene weapon systems. Bow hunting can be used successfully in all of the sub-Saharan ecologies to hunt all mammal sizes, from elephants to hares. Bow hunters can shoot birds, monkeys from the trees, and shallow swimming fish from rivers and lakes. It is therefore an ideal system for rich, biodiverse, tropical to temperate landscapes. It is the only Paleolithic weapon system that can be fired from concealed positions. This increase in hunting distance and stealth limits much of the risk involved in hunting African game. For the first time, hunters can now choose to hunt alone, in pairs, or in groups of any size. This flexibility in group size may have been key to Homo sapiens' successful spread out of Africa. But bow hunting seems to decrease dramatically with a warmer MIS3 phase, when a combination of assegai and javelin hunting once again becomes dominant. The warmer climates probably congregated large herds of land mammals, and people could now also live in larger groups, with several groups perhaps sharing the same abundant ecologies. Such animal and human population structures would suggest large hunting groups, with increased opportunities for male hunting initiations and a symbolic display of hunting prowess to to reflect mating fitness and hunter status. Interestingly, tips with ballistic properties suitable for arrows now creep into the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and Homo sapiens settles in Western Europe, perhaps with their bows and arrows as indicated by the recent paper by Metz et al. For the MIS2 glacial, I do not have tip data to present, but by now all human populations are Homo sapiens, probably choosing between best weapons according to a hunting scenario and social convention. It is during this phase that we have the best evidence for the origins of hunting with spear throwers and darts. This weapon system is more robust than the bow and arrow and better suited for glacial conditions. People can hunt with mittens or gloves. This is something that cannot be done with archery. The stopping power of a dart is greater than that of an arrow, which reduces long-distance tracking of wounded animals in hostile environments such as water, snow, and ice. So currently it would seem that African bow hunting preceded dart hunting, and that dart hunting was a European adaptation to the last glacial maximum. So this graphic would best represent my current reconstruction of the evolution of old world hunting weapons. It seems that the MIS-12 glacial prompted the invention of bimanual thrusting spears. About 200,000 years later, during the MIS-8 glacial, people may have started to hunt habitually with one-handed stabbing spears, or assegais. The long MIS-6 cold phase that you can see over here seems to have stimulated experimentation with hunting from a greater distance with lightweight javelins. The MIS-4 cold snap prompted bow hunting in southern Africa so that these hunters could now choose between weapon systems and the size of hunting groups. And during the last glacial maximum, European Homo sapiens invented dart hunting to facilitate mass hunting on the mammoth steppe. Thus it seems that glacial conditions stimulated innovations and inventions in hunting technologies. Whilst on the other hand, interglacial conditions may have stimulated the structuration of group hunting and the development of increasingly complex socio-cultural conventions associated with hunting. Based on current and ancient DNA, it seems as though human populations grew steadily since they started hunting with spears, reaching a plateau just before the MIS-6 glacial. The long MIS-6 glacial and the climatic fluctuation of the MIS-5 interglacial seem to have had a negative effect on population sizes, especially in non-African populations. Some southern African populations show a rise in numbers associated with MIS-4 and the invention of bow hunting in the region. At the same time, some non-African populations shrink to very low numbers. And sometime during the last glacial maximum, non-African Homo sapiens population sizes rise dramatically, whilst others seem to have reached their end. It is not clear yet how these population data link with the development of hunting weapons or vice versa, but I suggest it may be a useful exploration going forward. So why did certain weapon systems originate at certain times? And why is hunting with bows and arrows exclusive to Homo sapiens as far as we know thus far? In the quest for some of these questions, I want to end with a few words on my co-evolutionary cognitive work on bow hunting. Currently, I think that bow hunting has to do with a sapien-specific brain configuration that developed after our split from other groups. This configuration allows for advanced asymmetrical bimanual technical manipulation and for effective visuospatial integration through time and across space. It would seem that techno-behavior such as bow hunting is not possible without advanced asymmetrical engagement, effective visuospatial integration, and the ability to pay attention in complex ways. These traits probably only developed into their current configuration with the expansion of the human precuneus, which forms part of the default network as bridge between embodied experience and cognition. The expansion of the precuneus and the connectivity of the default network seems to be connected to the globularization of the Homo sapiens brain sometime between 160 and 100,000 years ago. This likely also developed in tandem with multigenetic selection in the sapient brain for the ability to pay attention, which is something that I'm currently exploring in a submission to philosophers. And on that note, I thank you for your attention and for listening.
Thank you very much, Marlize.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting talk. Let's try to see, is there any question or comments first from the assembly?
I have a question, or actually a comment. Marlize, that was brilliant as always, and I always learn so much. So thank you for that. I love your attempt to integrate the demographic size, the population size data with what's happening with weapon technology, and I think that's really, really important. What's unfortunate is that those effective population sizes that you're using are actually a measure of genetic variation rather than actual census size. So if you look at modern humans today, our effective population size is like in the tens of thousands, but our census size is 8 billion. But unfortunately, there's not really any good data. Do you think there might be a possibility to use something like just site density, like the number of archaeological levels that are known at different time periods as a rough measure of census size?
So, no, I don't think so, simply because there's so much that has not been excavated.
Yeah.
And even when we excavate the few squares that we excavate, it's very difficult to go to population sizes from there. I play with a genetic data because it's a starting point. I know that it is really, but it's the only starting point that we have. And perhaps it shows us trends. I don't think we should bother about the numbers that they show, like 10,000 or 30,000 or 50,000, but I do think they may indicate trends or bottlenecks. Can everybody hear me? Francesco, is it loud enough? Okay. So I'm just, I have a real woman's brain, so everything is mixed in my brain. So therefore, I always add. It's the neurocomplexity. It's the DNA. It's our physical capacities. It's the weapons, and trying to figure out how these things fit together and the co-evolutionary trends, and especially also when I did this, how it goes with perhaps patterns in climatic disruptions or variation in climatic. So Steve, this is just me playing with the data that's at hand and show you guys what's there. And then we can start tease apart. The only way to do this is now to break it down again into smaller parts and do the detailed analysis for the smaller parts. But I do think it's sometimes valuable to see these really big pictures with as much data as possible, because they prompt certain things. It was only during preparing this talk that I was starting. I've always said that spear hunting is a group hunting thing. And then when I start seeing the trends falling into the glacial sections, and you can perhaps start seeing the co-evolutionary trends for these things, I think that's very interesting. And I haven't published that yet. So some of that are totally new ideas that came with the preparation of this paper.
Thank you very much, Marlize, actually, for sharing that with us. We have a question from Reuven, actually. Reuven Yeshurun from Haifa University.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk, Marlize, very interesting. My question is about the tip cross-sectional measurements that you base most of your analysis on. How confident are you about the stone tools, the stone points that they were all or most used actually for hunting or designed for hunting?
As I said, the method cannot tell us whether a specific tip was used for hunting. From the work that I've been doing the last 20 years in Africa, if you see a point in Africa and you tell me it was used for something else, you need to show it, because what we have here is that these stone tools were almost certainly as assemblages used for hunting. And especially people that talk about hunting and that fauna, if you look at, we accept it very easily that people were hunting, they needed to hunt with something, Ruben. So I don't say that each of those tips were used for hunting at all, but if you look at morphometrics of an assemblage, and they have certain trends, and you consider that people made tools for certain purposes, whether it was hunting or something else, what the method that I use simply gives the best fit ballistic probability. So they can use the same tip for a knife tip or for a scraper if they want to use it, but that point would fall into that weapon's best fit probability. And last year we've quite expanded the known weapons, because we really worked from John Shea's work, and we measured hundreds of more weapons from Africa on all the ranges, apart from the atl, the dart tips. That is a mystery that someone else needs to please figure out. This method cannot distinguish, because previously nobody looked at javelins. And I think that is a big gap in how we think about the evolution of hunting weapons. Javelins really straddle that from spear to distance hunting. And we will be looking at Ethiopian weapons soon with Jonathan Sali, and there's still 3 groups in Ethiopia that hunt only with javelins. So, but when you use this method, the javelin category completely overlaps with the dart category. So that's why I'm really not confident with talking about darts and atls. But that the ballistic properties for the tip assemblages fit within a weapon group, that I'm relatively confident about. That each and every tip were used as a weapon tip, that I cannot tell unless I put each one under the microscope.
Thank you.
Interesting. Let's take a last question, perhaps, with Bruno. Bruno, you have...
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Luc. I don't know if you have seen the collection, but I would like to know what could be your idea about the Neronian published by Ludovic Slimak and Laure Mest.
Sorry, I
would like to have your idea of what is for you the Neronian, the culture defined by Ludovic Slimak at the Grotte Mandrin.
Oh, yes.
Just to have your idea about this.
I agree with their interpretation and the methods that they use. To me, if those artifacts were used for hunting, there's almost no other weapon tip that they could have been used for, the smaller parts. I think they have 3 different categories in weapons for Mandrin, but there are some that are so small that I don't think it can be used for anything else. My thing is with the European perception of weapon use and the idea that arrows were only used since the Holocene. I'm very comfortable that early Homo sapiens came with bows and arrows into Europe. And they may have adapted their hunting weapons in Europe to hunt different weapon types, because I don't think people are only bow hunters or only spear hunters. People who hunt in Africa today have thrusting spears and stabbing spears and javelins and bows and arrows. One person has got everything. So I think once you're Homo sapiens, you adapt to what you are hunting, how you are hunting, and also the kind of group configuration in which you are hunting in. So bow hunting is very, very good for small groups, for core families or just two families, very successful in that. If you have bigger groups, the male posturing will almost demand that you fall back onto spear hunting again, because it's more dangerous, and that testosterone thing that Steve spoke about, you will fall back onto spear hunting for some of the things. So I'm very comfortable that Homo sapiens came into Europe with the potential to use bows and arrows, were bow hunting. And I think as we develop methods to look at these things, we will find more and more evidence. I think Mandarin is the first of probably many to come, because the same thing is also happening elsewhere in Eastern Africa and on some of the islands where people are looking with different eyes at the weapons or at the potential for artifacts to have functioned as weapons.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer.
Excellent. Clearly there's an interest, and it was worth actually making this tipping point seminar, but sadly, Marlize, we're going to have to give the microphone to our last speaker, Michael Lombardo, who will speak to us sorry, about stick and stone, the role of projectile weapons in shaping human evolutions. So Michael, you can share your screen whenever you want.
Yeah, first, thanks for the invitation to participate in here, and just please bear with me here while I get my presentation. So what I'm planning on talking about today are really two things. One is, if we're going to talk about projectile weapons, we need to talk a bit about the evolution of throwing, and then lead that into some of the reasons why we see sex differences in throwing today, and then how this also relates to weaponry. Right? So there are two watershed events in human evolution. First, the evolution of bipedal locomotion, 64, maybe longer, million years ago, and then the evolution of high-speed throwing, overhand throwing. And what I'm interested in are the ecological causes of that and the evolutionary consequences of that transition. Now, I had a childhood revelation when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, and I was bouncing a ball off the side of my house, learning how to catch and learning how to throw, and I saw a squirrel run across the yard, and in my recollection, without even thinking, I turned, threw the ball at the squirrel, hit it broadside, and the light bulb went on in my head. I can affect action at a distance. And of course, Darwin realized the same thing, is that, with the evolution of throwing, man would have been better able to defend themselves with stones or clubs, to attack their prey or otherwise obtain food. So this really was a tipping point. Once the traits that allowed overhand throwing evolved, came together, probably in Homo erectus, we didn't look back. It really changed the trajectory of human evolution in a variety of different ways, from ecological, becoming ecologically superior to changing our social behavior. So it's a fundamental human characteristic. We're the only predators that habitually use high-speed overhand projectile throwing, and we use it to imitate, injure, and kill our rivals, and we use it to injure and kill our prey. We have anatomical adaptations for throwing, and we use overhand throwing in several different contexts. It starts early in life, and actually, here's my granddaughter when she was 2 or 3.
Wow!
Oh,
Actually,
are you
pretty
going to
good.
catch with Grandpa? Good.
Actually, pretty good throw
Oh.
there.
Oh, are you going to play catch with Grandpa? Good.
And in forager societies, practice throwing projectile weapons begins early. And here's a young boy from West Africa who's practicing throwing the spear. And in his left hand, he has his spear thrower. We, of course, use it in hunting. Right? We use it in warfare. Even when we are very overmatched, and here's an old news photo of a Palestinian boy throwing a rock at an Israeli tank. And one of our first responses, often in conflict situations, is to pick up an object and throw it, whether it's a stone or a brick or a stick during conflicts, including riot situations or in warfare. And of course, we use it when we think of throwing today, we most often think of it in terms of sports, at least in the Western world. And when we're not thinking about people in technologically primitive societies that still use throwing during hunting. So we place a great deal of emphasis on the ability to throw far, to throw fast, to intercept or dodge projectiles. And we throw ancient weapons like the javelin and the discus. And we also give a lot of weight and status to those who are able to throw heavy objects like a shot put or throw a hammer, which was probably used as an ancient weapon as well. Now, what I'm talking about today is part of a much larger product where I'm interested in, with my colleagues, interested in the evolution of throwing in the human lineage and looking at what were the ecological causes that stimulated the selection for throwing, examining the evolutionary consequences of a long history of throwing on human biology. And I've done that work with my colleague, Rob Diener. And I'm going to talk about some of the work we published in a paper in papers in Quarterly Review of Biology in 2018. And then I'm currently working with David Putz at Penn State University to talk about the roles that weapons, especially projectile weapons, may have played in shaping various aspects of human evolution, including human anatomy, human physiology, and human behavior. And the approach I take to looking at these types of questions is an approach that I take, a philosophy I take from the evolutionary biologist George Williams. And this is a long quote, but basically it boils down to the idea that if an organism has been subjected to a long history of natural selection, we expect it to have certain properties and not other properties. And those properties that we expect it to have are properties that lead to its individual reproductive and evolutionary success, or as he says, the maximal proliferation of the genes that direct the development of the organism. There should be no compromise with any other goal, like the survival of the species, that is group selection. And then what we do is, of course, as scientists, then we look at the organism to see whether it has or does not have the predicted properties. And so that's kind of the approach that we're taking here. So, excuse me, if our ancestors were subjected to a long history of selection for throwing, then we would expect them to have certain properties, and we'd expect them to have adaptations, evolutionarily evolved adaptations that are associated with throwing. We would expect them to have anatomical adaptations. We would expect them to have physiological adaptations and behavioral adaptations. And not only that, we would expect there to be sex differences in these adaptations if the causes of selection were stronger on one sex than the other sex. So the sex differences in throwing are interesting. And the reason why they're interesting is because they are amongst the largest sex differences that we see. And the sex differences in throwing are greater than those that we see in running and jumping. And given the amount of sex differences that we see in running and jumping, they're greater than we would expect. So for example, whether we're running short distances like the 100-meter dash, or running marathons, males run 10 to 12% faster, and that includes Olympic athletes, it includes youth as well. So it's across virtually all age classes. Males run about 10 to 12% faster than females. Males jump 15 to 20% farther and higher than females. But if we look at overhand throwing, males, at least in the Olympic sport of javelin, throw the javelin 30% farther, right? And that's the throwing implement that is most like an ancient weapon. And if we look at throwing balls, males throw balls 20 to 40% faster than females. So on the left-hand side of the screen are female throwers, on the right-hand side of the screen are male throwers, baseball throwers on the top, and cricket bowlers on the bottom. And the difference between males and females ranges from 20 to 40%. And that difference in throwing speed begins at the age of 3, before there are many physical differences between males and females. Now, we're not the only primates that throw, right? Chimpanzees throw, gorillas throw. There's an interesting article about a chimpanzee in a zoo in Arnhem in the Netherlands that would collect stones in his enclosure and then throw them at pesky observers at the zoo. So that evidence of planning, you pile up the stones and then throw them. And in fact, throwing occurs across all non-human primates. It's found in Old World and New World monkeys, and it's found in the apes. And the projectiles include stones and sticks and feces and whatever they can grab. The most common targets are conspecifics and humans. Throwing is best known in chimpanzees. It's occurs more often by males. They're more likely to throw projectiles, sticks, and stones during agonistic interactions. During play, female chimpanzees are more likely to carry sticks like their mothers, carry infants by their sides. Males are more likely to carry the sticks around like they're brandishing a weapon. Throwing most often occurs during agonistic interactions and rarely throws during hunting. Sometimes chimpanzees will throw sticks and stones at wild pigs and monkeys, but they rarely throw them at their targeted prey. But they do throw them at each other, and they throw them frequently at human observers. And Jane Goodall's group has one good anecdote of one group of observers that refused to watch one little group of chimpanzees because the dominant male would always throw rocks at them. So we can make a reasonable phylogenetic inference from the non-human primate literature, excuse me, and that is throwing in the context of agonistic behavior is an ancestral trait in Homo, and that throwing in the context of predation or hunting is a derived trait. It first arises in agonistic interactions, and then later on we transitioned it to hunting. So then the question is, when did habitual forceful overhand throwing become an important trait in humans? Well, the anatomical evidence suggests that pre-Homo hominids, hands were capable of the power and precision grips that were necessary to not only make stone tools and weapons, but also to wield those weapons. And then Neil Roach's paper back in 2013 showed that the traits in the shoulder and the arm and some other traits that are necessary for overhand forceful throwing came all together first in Homo erectus about 2 million years ago. If we look at artifact evidence, Alan Cannell argues that Manuport stones that are found in collections from 1.8 million years ago were used as projectile weapons, spears and darts, as we've heard earlier today, anywhere from 300,000 to 50,000 years ago. Projectile points anywhere from more than 100,000 to 50,000 years ago. So we have anatomical evidence and we have artifact evidence. And I find it curious that the anatomical evidence really precedes a lot of the artifact evidence, and that's probably because pre-Homo and early Homo probably used those articles that were at hand, sticks and stones, as the first projectile weapons before they started manufacturing projectile weapons. So if we think of natural selection, we think of it as resulting from non-random differential reproduction. It has ecological causes and evolutionary and/or genetic consequences. So non-random differential reproduction individuals, some individuals out-reproduce other individuals because they are different from those other individuals. And this can occur because of ecological causes, right? One individual out-competing the other individual for food, which is, or in out-competing the other individual for access to food or to mates, or what Darwin called in the struggle against the hostile forces of nature. We're going to focus on competition. And what are the evolutionary consequences of that? Well, hunting and agonistic interactions are probably the main ecological causes. Hunting, although females hunt, it's primarily a male activity, especially hunting big game. And champion hunters tend to obtain high status and tend to have high reproductive success in mates and in extra pair mates. Likewise with warriors, here we go. Likewise with warriors, warfare is primarily a male activity. And champion warriors tend to obtain high status and they tend to have high reproductive success, again, in collecting multiple wives and in extra pair matings. So the question is, was hunting or combat the more important ecological cause selecting for the evolution of throwing? It's really impossible to know, right? But throwing in threat displays is ancestral in primates. It's ancestral in agonistic interactions. And if we look at the costs of failure at hunting versus the failure at combat, the costs differ, suggesting that one might be a stronger cause of selection than the other. So if you fail at hunting, right? If you throw a projectile at a prey item and you miss, you lose a meal. But if you miss during combat, during fighting, there's a risk of becoming maimed or losing your life. And so the causes of selection are probably stronger during fighting than they are during hunting, but that doesn't negate the cost that might occur during hunting. So our main hypothesis, this with Rob Dean and I, is that the sex differences in throwing arose through a synergistic interaction between natural selection, male-male competition, right, in combat and for hunting success, and sexual selection, is that female mate choice for champion hunters and warriors. So in terms then, what do we see in terms of the evolutionary consequences or the predictive properties as George Williams mentioned? So we might expect then males to throw faster than females, and they do. Males can throw farther than females, and they do. Males are more accurate at targeting than females are. And I put asterisks in the next column here for intercepting and dodging projectiles. We have multiple predators, but we're the only predator. None of our predators throw things at us in any sort of effective way, including chimpanzees. And so the ability to intercept and dodge projectiles is superior in males and females, suggesting that there was stronger selection on males than on females to be able to intercept and or dodge projectiles during fighting than there were on females. It also turns out that training has little effect on the sex difference. Females do get better at throwing, but the sex difference remains, does not go away. It also looks like culture has little effect on the sex differences in throwing. So if you look at Australian Aboriginal boys and girls, boys throw better than girls, but girls and females use throwing during hunting and for defense. But if you compare the throwing abilities of Aboriginal girls in Australia with boys, for example, in Germany, in which overhand throwing is not a major sport, the boys in Germany actually throw better than the Aboriginal girls that have more practice at throwing. Rob and I also looked at some of the anatomical traits that are associated with facilitating overhand throwing. And 9 of 11 of those traits, which included things like humeral torsion, the morphology of the scapula and the glenoid fossa, general body size, waist length, leg length, arm length, finger length, hand length. 9 out of the 11 traits that we looked at, males had an advantage for throwing, suggesting stronger selection on males for throwing than for females. Oops. Go back. All right. So what we did was collect data from a variety of different sources that were collected from a variety of different sources that were collected for different purposes. So we looked at data from anatomy, anthropology, archaeology, childhood development, ethology, primatology, sports sciences, and they're all consistent with the hypothesis that throwing first aerobic agonistic interactions rather than hunting, and that selection was stronger in males than females. And so we see more strongly expressed adaptations for throwing in males than in females. So I want to leave you with some final thoughts about how weapons might have influenced the course of human affairs. And this overlaps quite a bit with what Steve was talking about during the first presentation. As I think about humans, I think that one of our fundamental characteristics is not just throwing, but the use of extrasomatic weapons. And that really sets us apart from other animals. And so here's this quote from the Aeneid from Virgil: "I sing of arms and the man." And this goes back to the emphasis on weaponry goes back to antiquity. So I want to leave you some final thoughts about weapons and how they might have influenced the course of human affairs. And this is some work that I've been working on a paper with David Putz about. So the weapons have the potential to affect the evolution of human intelligence. And this includes the manufacturing of weapons, like points, for example. But one of the questions that arises in my head all the time when I think about this is why we have such long, stable periods where the same types of points are used for very long periods of time. And then we have a change. There's a rapid change in some cases. They have the potential to affect the evolution of human intelligence because weapons, the presence of weapons, influence the dynamics of inter-individual agonistic interactions. Because agonistic interactions have an increased chance of becoming lethal with weapons. So entering into an agonistic interaction with another individual, you have to ask yourself, does my rival have a lethal weapon? Is his or her weapon better than mine? How do I de-escalate this encounter? Right, that's for individual interactions. So that requires, I think, a different level of cognition and psychological maneuvering. In terms of intergroup conflicts, I would argue with some of my colleagues that arms races drive the evolution of intelligence, and within group cooperation. Right? Groups need to be more coherent and more cooperative with one another if they are able to survive in conflict with other groups, especially if weapons are involved. And Paul Bingham has written that if you look across human history, each new weapon system roughly coincides with increased group sizes, with social and political complexity, including alliances between nation states, including NATO, especially after the Second World War, with the introduction of nuclear weapons. And this famous scene from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark brings across the point that keeping pace in an arms race is of paramount importance, right? So Indiana Jones's rival pulls out a sword. Indiana Jones realizes, if I just pull out my gun, this conflict is over. If you can't keep up in an arms race, whether as an individual or as groups, your future is limited. And the invention of firearms affected the dynamics of interpersonal intergroup conflicts. And a very popular 19th century aphorism in the United States was, "God made all men, Samuel Colt made them equal." And this goes to some of the things I want to ask Steve Churchill about a little later. And then there's an interesting bit in Don Quixote by Cervantes, where Don Quixote enters into a debate about the relative strengths of letters or laws and arms. And the bottom in red is the part I want to emphasize, where Don Quixote says, "To this arms make the answer that without them, laws cannot be maintained, for by arms states are defended, kingdoms preserved, cities protected, roads made safe, seas cleared of pirates, and in short, if it were not for them, states, kingdoms, monarchies, cities, war by sea and land would be exposed to the violence and confusion which war brings with it, so long as it lasts and is free to make use of its privileges and powers." So the introduction of weapons, the introduction of projectile weapons goes directly to some of the points that Steve Churchill was making in the first presentation. And I think the introduction of weaponry, especially projectile weapons, was really a tipping point in human evolution, because it set our trajectory in a different direction from that of a relatively defenseless bipedal pre-Homo ape. So in summary, throwing is a fundamental human characteristic. We use it in a variety of different contexts. We use it during warfare, we use it during hunting, we use it in these days in sports, which are in many ways just practice for warfare, at least arose initially as practice for warfare and hunting. We think that throwing likely first arose during agonistic interactions. The modern sex differences that we see are an evolutionary consequence of stronger selection on males than females. And weapons, especially projectile weapons, have shaped the evolution of human affairs. So thanks for your attention, and I'll try to answer any questions that somebody might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael.
Sure.
Broad-ranging presentation. I already see one hand. Marlize, do you want to pose your question?
No, that was actually just a clapping hands.
Oh, okay. Sorry, on my screen I couldn't tell.
But,
Okay.
but I do think that all of us gave, from different angles, very good insights into where things are with how these things could interweave with each other, human evolution with weapons and then projectile weapons especially. So thanks again for the invite, and for Mike and Steve for your presentations.
Thank you.
Duke, do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, well, I have a question. It's actually, well, first of all, Michael, thank you very much actually for this for this presentation. The question, I'm asking it to you, but it could also be answered. Well, I think both you and Marlize would have to join together, perhaps, to give an answer to that. There was a paper by Beberts and colleague in August, actually, in I think it was a scientific report, on the use of atlatl being, when it was introduced, actually, that it could have potentially have equalized this difference between male and female, actually. And I was wondering, perhaps this is well, it's actually for both of you. In which social context, basically, would we want to lower this difference, actually, between male and female? And if we're projecting, actually, this social context in the past, could we use this as an indicator for looking at the emergence of this technology in the past? That would be more from Marlize, I guess.
So, shall I go, or Michael, do you want to go?
Go ahead. I don't have a comment.
Yes, please do so.
I think that's an interesting question that I haven't, but if you want to equalize male and female power, I would say it would be under conditions where males alone cannot provide enough anymore, that you need more people to be active hunters. So I think that might be a push for that. And then if you look then at if there's any validity in that, perhaps the glacials may have stimulated these weapon systems that really pushed people into boundaries to use different ecologies or to start hunting weapons. So I would say it's when you want more hunters on the ground that you would want to take the women folk into your hunting parties, if you want to equalize, if that was the purpose of inventing the system.
Right. That argument makes sense to me, but it would improve the hunting efficiency of females because they'd be able to throw those darts farther than they would without the spear throw. But males, because they are larger on average, have longer arms, longer legs, more upper body strength, would still have an advantage in being able to throw those darts faster and farther and remain as more efficient hunters. So I don't really see it as equalizing male and female, but what it does is it may decrease the gap somewhat between males and females. But I would still see males as having a physical advantage in terms of using those weapons for hunting or for other purposes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, interesting, they showed that it enhances female throwing power, but we still don't know whether women folk used it in the past to the same extent that men do. That is now, when you do these experiments, now you have to go back and see whether you can find whether that was one of the factors that happened there.
Could I add something as well? I agree with both Michael and Marlize on this. And the thing is too, that like atlatls may level the field a little bit, but first off, they require some practice, a sort of a long period of practice to become proficient with it. And the question becomes, what would be the motivation for any group at any point in time for females to really become proficient with the technology? In general, females can certainly hunt, and they do hunt. But the fundamental problem is that hunting generally requires rapt attention and some degree of silence, and that is incompatible with being responsible for children. And since women are generally saddled with the children, it makes it difficult for them to engage in any kind of prolonged hunting. So what you tend to see among foraging groups is that females hunt opportunistically. They're out foraging and they come across a snake or a lizard or something like that, and they bash it with digging sticks and kill it and bring it back to camp. So it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which there was a payoff for females to really invest in learning the technology. And the other thing is, I don't see why the bow and arrow isn't also an equalizer. I mean,
Right.
So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, see, but it equalizes it somewhat, but still, because males are stronger, they can pull back the bow farther, and the arrow goes faster.
Right.
So, and if you think about classic literature, right? So when Odysseus gets home, his rivals can't pull his bow, right? So you have to be able to be strong to pull the bow, and so males have an innate advantage in that. So when I've talked about this in class, I've talked about it in this particular context. And if you think about either spear throwing, throwing spears, using a spear thrower, using arrows, and you have 2 groups, you have a group of males and a group of females that are fighting with one another. The males can be farther away from the females, and the females need to be from the males in order to be effective. So the advantage is there, and the advantage is there in hunting as well. So males can be farther away from their prey than the females.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your detailed response. Sorry, Chris, I thought you were. All right, well, we have 3 hands here. Actually, we have one by Sébastien Villotte. Then we have.
I think Seb was first. So
All right, Sébastien.
Thanks to all the speakers for this really nice talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
yes,
Yeah, good. Excellent. My question is more about the science and society right now, because all the talks you gave roughly go in the same way, and it doesn't fit well with the story that some people would like to hear right now. And there is quite a discrepancy between what I hear here or what Steve and I were in a meeting last year in May about human evolution, and so there are some talks, some way to think, and what you can find in some papers. We got the paper in the Andes with the female hunter. We've got a paper recently in PLOS ONE showing that, well, discussing the fact that women are actually in hunter-gatherer societies big game hunters also. So there's quite a big discrepancy between what I hear right now, with my personal result actually also, and what is discussed in other places, and I would say in a simplistic way, let's say in humanities. So I would like to know the opinion of the speakers about this situation, but let's say more political than scientific.
Marlize, go ahead.
So as a woman, shall I answer?
Please, yes.
I think some women hunt, and some women may have always hunted. But I don't think it was ever in hunter-gatherer societies the main activity of all women, in the way that those of us who grew up in areas where there are still hunter-gatherers, it is mainly a male activity, whether we want to see it as reality or not. That doesn't mean that some women didn't or wouldn't hunt, and especially in Africa, the recent, let's say, Holocene hunter-gatherer groups are so small, they are core families. So if a guy would have passed away or were traveling, there would be nothing that would stop the woman to take the bow or a javelin and hunt. But I think from what we know, and those of us who have interacted with the people and what we know about these societies, is that is not usually the dominant activity of women. And that mainly comes with women being pregnant and having babies. And that capacity, and if you take hunter-gatherers, if they have babies, 3 babies over a lifespan every 5 or 6 years, it takes out 15 to 20 years out of a woman in her prime age, that she would be either pregnant or being breastfeeding a baby or have toddlers around her. And that would just take out most women with children out of hunting capacities. And then if you take usually hunter-gatherer women, people would not live longer than 45, 50, perhaps 60 years old in Holocene times, from what we know from the human remains in southern Africa. So I think for a large part of a woman's life, she would not be an effective hunter because there might have been other priorities.
Martin, do you want to ask your question or make a comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a comment or a question really, but it was prompted by comments both by Michael and Marlize. I was interested in the idea of males being better at intercepting and dodging projectiles, and the idea that this can only have really developed through conflict with other humans and not from hunting. And I'm also interested in this shift from bimanual spears to one-handed spears, because if you're trying to kill a large animal and you score a hit, I would think that a bimanual thrust is more likely to do the job. But if you're fighting with other humans, why would only moving to a one-handed spear confer an advantage? And I wonder if it confers an advantage against other humans because it allows you to do something with the other hand, which is that this may be the point at which people start to develop protective gear or protective strategies, because it allows people to develop shields. So yeah, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but there you go.
Yeah, well, my first response to that is that before throwing spears were invented, our ancestors were undoubtedly throwing sticks and stones at prey and at each other, and just as chimpanzees throw sticks and stones at each other. And so the advantages of being able to intercept or dodge a projectile are obvious. So if you think about riot situations, and we talk about this in one of our papers, in riot situations, when the rioters are throwing stones and bricks, the law enforcement that have firearms are afraid of getting hurt and getting killed, and sometimes fire on the rioters. And so the ability to dodge and intercept projectiles is a really important adaptation in conflict. And then, of course, what we've done is we've transferred that to our sports now, and being able to intercept, catch, and dodge projectiles.
And okay, I'll take from bimanual to single-handed spears. I have looked at many African weapons, and some people still hunt elephant and hippopotamus with bimanual spears. But these things are really thick. You need two hands. The diameter of the shafts are so big that you cannot have a powerful stab with a single hand, because your hand cannot close in a real tight grip on the bimanual spears. So the assegais, if you really want to read about how effective they are, is the best example is Zulu warfare, and the Zulu warriors that fought against the English soldiers, and how effective they were with the assegais. So the shafts of assegais are only about 1 meter long. So you can run and you are very flexible. And that, so stabbing, the shafts are also just less than about 2 centimeters, between 1.5 and 2 centimeters. So you can really have a tight grip to stab it. You can run, and then you can throw it very effectively over 5 to 10 meters. And then later on with the shields. So you can have either 3 of the spears in your hand, so that if you throw it, you can immediately have another one, or you can have a shield in your other hand. So I think that vantage is quite great over the bimanual stabbing spears that are all round about 2 meters long, very unwieldy. You can never carry more than one weapon. They have their advantages, but I think that one-handed stabbing spear, and I also think, because in all the work that I've done, they are almost always one of the most prolific weapon tip types. And I think it's, if you fight a lion in Africa, you don't want to lose your weapon, because then you're, so a javelin can't do much. You can't run away with a bimanual spear, but those assegais are really effective. So they have quite a big, I think, adaptive advantage.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael, please.
I actually have a question for Steve. So today we've been talking about muscle-propelled weapons. And then, as I pointed out in my presentation, that the introduction of firearms changed everything. And so, in your talk, you talked about the differences in facial anatomy as went from one weapon type to another. Is there any evidence that there's an increase in variation in male morphotype or even female morphotype once firearms are introduced and using weapons that are propelled primarily by muscle become less important?
That's an interesting question, and unfortunately I don't know the answer to that. I don't even know where the data might exist to look at that, but that's a very interesting question. Yeah.
There's some historical anecdotal instances with women that were quite expert at shooting various kinds of firearms. But there again, it's anecdotal. I'm thinking of people like Annie Oakley and so on, who were quite crack shots. But again, they're rare, and I don't think they've been studied, at least I'm not aware of it, in any kind of systematic or detailed way. However, one of the things that has been disturbing me about this particular part of our discussion today is that, in fact, power does not necessarily equate to accuracy. And whether that's dealing with powder weapons or firearms, or in fact, and basketballs for that matter. And what I'm wondering, in fact, is, are we putting enough emphasis on accuracy with these weapon systems? I mean, some of them was mentioned that the atlatl throwing board is very hard to learn. I can attest to that. I've tried it, and it takes a completely different motion, as far as I'm concerned, from that throwing a baseball or a cricket ball. And what I would then to preface that is it possible to study ancient weapon systems to look more than power, but at accuracy? In other words, not just hitting something, but actually hitting the target. And it seems to me then that might reduce this very extreme engendered part or sex-related part of throwing behavior. I just ask that as a sort of general question.
What you're saying makes sense to me. The only way to improve accuracy, though, is lots and lots of practice, right? And so,
yes,
as Marlize pointed out in the beginning, and Steve pointed out, is what would be the motivation for females that are occupied with other things to spend a lot of time throwing spears or sticks at trees to improve their accuracy?
Yeah, I mean, one of the other thing that perhaps is hidden behind all of this is socialization processes. For one reason or another, when I was younger, I played a lot of basketball with female basketball players, and these were not just anybody; they were actually university level. And one of the things that astounded me about them is how easy they were to play with, how they're incredibly accurate shots, especially set shots. But I think this stark difference may be because we're looking at very, very recent and very specific contexts. And I'm wondering, in say 10 or 20 years time, even in those contexts where sport is throwing sports are so associated with males, that they will become, some females, and I'm putting things like tennis in this, will become as proficient, maybe not as powerful, but as proficient in playing or hitting targets. I see nothing to prevent that in human female physiology. In other words, hand-eye coordination and so on. This is, again, more of a question. I don't know if there's data on this, but it seems to me that between this.
But if I may, and if we have time, look. So that is an interesting thing, Chris, and that is why I'm so fascinated by the work on the precuneus and the cognitive evolution and the visuospatial integration. So if Emiliano Brunner is correct, then there's a huge difference between the archaic human species and Homo sapiens, and that is specifically with the hand-eye coordination and then distance through time and across space. And if you look at modern archers, because I'm currently doing a lot of work on modern archers, and if you look at the females and the males, they are equally accurate. They are not equally powerful, but they are equally accurate. And then the ability, and that is the thing, I think we were throwing things with force for quite long, but whether we were throwing it accurately with enough force to kill, and that is also one of the things that I think recently there's been a new paper by Annemieke Milks and her group on the throwing ability of wooden spears. And those spears, yes, they can be thrown, and they can be thrown far, but can they be thrown far with such force and so accurate that a wooden spear would pierce a horse's skin to kill it? And I'm not convinced that it can. I think that wooden spear would just bounce back from any height over several meters. But that is a perception, and I think that needs to be tested. So you can throw things far, but there's only certain things that you can throw far and do enough damage. And that is the accuracy and a small tip that will slice into the skin of the animal to hurt it and capacitate it. And then hunters today, it's not a single javelin, they will throw 20 javelins and then only come in with a spear, a handheld spear to get to the jugular of the animal. So to get back to your accuracy, I think there's a lot of data in sports psychology that will show us that women are equally accurate. But and then again, all humans are somewhere on a spectrum of male and female, and some women can be very powerful because they are closer to a male's physique because of their body and how they are constructed. But the accuracy, I think, is a cognitive thing in our brains. And I think most humans are in a similar spectrum about how accurate they can throw.
Thank you. Luc, do you have a question or comment?
Well, it's more of a comment. I find your idea very interesting, Marlize, but I think also the accuracy has, sorry, let me start over. I don't think that accuracy and force is being acquired or embodied at the same time. Accuracy to me would be more acquired for young people in game during game. And so basically both males and females actually could acquire this an extra level of accuracy or become more and more precise actually with the accuracy. As to force is basically more something that divides between boys and girls at the adolescence. And this could actually also explain the thing. I don't know if it's simply cognitive, but there could be also a developmental aspect to it, I think. Yeah. Sorry.
Francesco? Yes, I see your hand. Yes, go ahead.
Well, at the end of your talk, Marlize, you mentioned the possibility that the evolution of hunting weapon may have led to a reconfiguration of the brain network, creating area in a modern human brain that would be different from our other ancestor. But we were wondering what the role of brain plasticity in that process. Perhaps is not, I would say, anatomical reconfiguration, but just the role of plasticity in teaching. But after all, there are many innovation, for example, writing and reading that also require a very specific involvement of some brain area, but have not led to a new speciation event. So what make you sure that this is really was a reconfiguration and not just an implementation of existing area through teaching and brain plasticity?
Okay, first, these two things happen. I think the one cannot happen without the other, but I'm not sure which came, whether our minds first evolved to be as plastic and the precuneus will, but the precuneus did evolve to facilitate visuospatial accuracy and integration in a much more advanced level. So there is a visuospatial and a physical thing. And if you, that paper that I've just published in the Oxford Encyclopedia goes through this in quite detail with the precuneus. So again, it's a chicken or egg thing, Francesco. I don't say that bow hunting stimulated those things in the brain. It may be that the other things stimulated the brain to be in that, but learning cannot facilitate the visuospatial integration. You can only gain the visuospatial integration with haptic, with engagement with something over space and through time. So I think there's a very strong thing that our ability for complex, like playing a piano and that kind of thing, the bimanual engagement. And the thing with the bow and arrow is that you do two different things with your hands.
And so, no, I understand. Well, they say a corollary of the question is if born and arrow would develop, let's say, around 60,000, for example, in South Africa or in other area, how this fit with the idea that these were already modern humans, so let's say this integration would apparently not be substantial in the creation of a new species, because they were modern human before 60,000 and after 60,000.
I agree. And again, 60,000, and actually I'm pushing bow and arrows back to 70 to 80,000 at the moment, I think. And again, we don't stop evolving, and our brains don't stop evolving. Even though we are Homo sapiens, we've been Homo sapiens for 300,000 years, but we don't stop evolving, and our brains continually change. So, and that globularization that comes with the expansion of the precuneus is in its modern capacity around about 100,000. So it started already. So it's most probably that things like javelin hunting and other technologies. Bow and arrow is just an example of other technologies and other behaviors that people may have engaged in. And it's a continuous co-evolutionary process. But the thing that I think that convinces me that it's a technological thing is the visuospatial integration that is facilitated in certain brain areas and makes that increasingly better to be able to handle with. And then the plasticity in the brain comes with bow and arrow. You have to visualize your success. So archers spend thousands of hours practicing and visualizing their next shot. So I think there's also that thing of imagination, and that is where the plasticity of the brain comes in.
I think we've gone into the general discussion now, so which is good. It was a very nice transition. And I would just like to, yes, Luke, I would just like to try to bring in some of the names that I see on my screen that we haven't heard from yet. If there are people that we haven't heard from yet that would like to ask a question or make a comment before we close. It seems that people are generally satisfied and haven't been encouraged to ask any more probing questions. So I think Luc, do you want to conclude?
Well, we can say first thank you to all three speakers actually for your time and for answering all the questions. It was extremely interesting. And also thank you, Melina, for the organization actually and the technical support. And please go on the GPR Human Past webpage actually to keep yourself posted with upcoming seminars. There's actually a few coming up this fall. So please do not hesitate. And thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.